year is 2007, the setting is Iraq, a country fresh from war, still picking up the pieces. A convoy of trucks is heading to a bomb explosion site. At one point, the men on the trucks get off. They stop all other vehicles to let the trucks pass first. All cars stop, except one. What follows is a massacre. The men from the trucks fire at the car. They fire at screaming civilians. One of them continues to shoot despite warnings. Someone points a gun at him. That's when he stops. This is a true story. It is called the Nisour Square Massacre. 17 people were killed, 17 Iraqis. And who were the killers? Americans. Fighters who belonged to a company called BlackWater. Now they're called Academy. In 2007, they were BlackWater, a private military company in the United States. And why am I telling you their story 15 years later? Because of this, the Wagner rebellion. Suddenly, private armies are in the news. You think private army, you think Wagner, but it wasn't the first. The United States has been using such fighters for years. Chances are you haven't heard about them because they don't make it to the headlines like Wagner does. But Russian or American, what do these companies do? Why do governments support them? And how did BlackWater help the US in Iraq? More importantly, why should you care? Hello and welcome, I'm Palki Sharma, and on this show we'll try to read between the lines, the stated and the unstated, the obvious and the hidden, to bring you the full story. All of us have assumptions about war, especially about who fights a war. The men and women in uniform. In our minds, they belong to an army and hence to a country. But that's not always true. National armies often do not fight every war. So who fights them? The likes of Wagner and BlackWater. Private military companies, contracted soldiers. They don't do it out of loyalty. They do it for money. And this is not a new concept. The ancient Egyptians had them. The pharaohs employed mercenaries. There were Nubian archers, Libyan charioteers. They fought for the Egyptians. The ancient Romans and Greeks used mercenaries too. Then we had the colonial powers, the British, the French, the Dutch. They too had private armies. They used them to expand their colonies. So the practice is old, but it boomed after the Cold War. That's because countries began downsizing their armies. A lot of soldiers were jobless. So they joined private military companies, especially in the 90s. You see, states were rushing to privatize, so security too became a commodity, something you could buy or sell. Which brings us to the private military industry of today. The sector is unregulated. There are very few rules. The fighters are not considered soldiers as per international law. So what exactly are they? Ambiguous. And that's their USP. Low wages, no pensions, and no rules. They do all the dirty work. National armies are governed by laws. They face investigations and trials for war crimes. But private militaries are not bound by any of this. They give a government plausible deniability, meaning you can hire and send these fighters into a conflict zone, but you can deny responsibility for their actions, which is what the Russians tried to do in Ukraine, which is also what the Americans did in Iraq with BlackWater. This company was founded in 1997 by a former Navy SEAL, this man, ERIK. The headquarters were in North Carolina. And why did they call it BlackWater? It was named after the particularly dark groundwater near the headquarters. So this private military company was set up. It took part in a few conflicts here and there, but what changed its fortunes was the war in Iraq. It was the beginning of a golden era of military contracts. In August 2003, BlackWater received its first Iraq contract. It was worth $21 million, but they kept a low profile. The world learned about them only in 2004. That's when 4 of their fighters were killed in Iraq, but the company kept growing. By 2008, BlackWater was training some 40,000 people every year. Its fighters were all over the world, but mostly in Iraq. Now, you may have seen countless movies on the Iraq War. They usually come from Hollywood and they glorify the role of the US Army. But they don't talk about private armies. And we can tell you, Iraq was full of them. By 2007, there were 100,000 such fighters in Iraq. Most of them were BlackWater fighters. They were on a $1 billion contract to protect American diplomats. In fact, one estimate says there were more than 160,000 private fighters, which is roughly equal to the total number of US troops in Iraq. But this story is not just about the numbers, it's also about the role they played. BlackWater was doing everything for the Americans, guarding facilities, protecting high-value individuals, training the military, and carrying out critical operations. This was Washington's Dirty Works Department. They were involved in multiple war crimes. I just told you about the Nisour massacre. It was just one example. How do you shoot down 17 innocent civilians because one car refuses to give you way? And what action do you face for this? Criminal prosecution of private military companies rarely happens, but in this case, there were many headlines. It roiled America and Iraq. So the men involved were charged. 4 of them were even convicted. This episode raised questions about the role of BlackWater, their legal status, their management, their oversight, and their lack of accountability. In 2007, investigators from the US State Department traveled to Iraq, and they found evidence of misconduct. Do you know what happened next? BlackWater turned on them. One of their fighters threatened to kill an investigator, a US State Department investigator, and soon these investigators were kicked out of Iraq. Why? Because Washington could not afford to upset BlackWater. That's how desperately they needed them. The Nisour massacre was heinous, but it wasn't the only one. There were rapes, murders, incidents of torture, all brushed under the rug. This is the legacy of America's private army, a story of atrocities and state complicity. Today, the world talks about the Wagner Group, the way they turned against Putin, and what their ruthless fighters are doing in the conflict zones where they operate. It's horrible, and it must be checked. But the horrors of BlackWater should not be forgotten. Neither should America's role in their rise. Between 1994 and 2007, the US invested some $300 billion in 12 private militias, $300 billion. This gave rise to the likes of BlackWater. The US kept ignoring their crimes to appease them. Those 4 guards I told you about, the ones convicted for the massacre, they were later pardoned. Former US President Donald Trump pardoned them. ERIK Prince has since renamed and sold the firm. Like I said, it's now known as Academy. Now you can change the name, but how will you undo their crimes? And you can point fingers at Russia, but who will hold the US accountable for their crimes? Think about it.